There's no such thing as natural disasters. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that and then kind of break down my thoughts on this. This is one of those interesting things where I feel like it's both right and wrong, and you can learn a little bit about how disasters are thought of, how they're defined, and how this is looked at from a disaster risk reduction perspective. Now, the idea of there's no such thing as natural disasters comes from the United Nations and from, I believe, the UNDRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction people. The idea behind this is that people don't often get the difference between what a hazard and a disaster is, and essentially what they have is a public information campaign that tries to get people to stop saying the word natural in front of disaster, because disasters always have a human component. And they follow that up with a call to action where they say, if you're at one of these conferences or something and a purported expert gets on front of a stage and says natural disaster, that you're supposed to, go up to the mic and correct them and tell them that they're wrong. I'm of many minds on this. I'm going to kind of walk you through the different ways that this is interpreted, and you'll kind of see why. The first way has to do with one's understanding of the term and kind of this progression here. So you'll have kind of your beginner that has no exposure to disaster risk reduction. You'll have your person who's just kind of gotten into the field, and then you'll have your sort of seasoned expert that has specific meanings for specific things. So let's kind of walk through this. Your lay person will hear the word natural disaster and will just think hurricane. They'll generally think that the thing that is natural, that's in the environment, is causing a really bad thing to happen, and it's that simple. There's no really other further looking into it. Of course, it's a natural disaster. It's a natural thing that happened. It just happened. In some insurance historically, a lot of insurance doesn't really call it this anymore, but it's just kind of an easy adage people have used to describe these general clauses in insurance that refer to stuff that's outside of your control. That's been referred to often as act of God or wrath of God, or it was not out of my control, type of event. So if you, like, for example, were to search up on the internet, act of God insurance, you'll likely come up with results that tell you that that's not used in insurance, but it'll give you more sort of definitions of what they're talking about. The natural disaster usually refers to that sort of thing for the layperson. Let's move on a bit. You get to the person who is, just getting into disaster risk reduction. Once that happens, the idea behind disaster and hazard and these concepts is separated. A disaster specifically within this field is an event that occurs because you have a hazard that people have been exposed to that has impacted a vulnerability, and the result of that interaction is the disaster. So if you have a tornado in a desert, sure. If you have a tornado in a desert and no one lives there, it's not a disaster because no one was exposed to it. If you have a snowstorm in Canada and you're exposed to it, but you live in a house that is able to take the storm and you're not vulnerable to it, it wasn't a disaster. There was a hazard, you were exposed to the hazard, but you weren't vulnerable to the hazard. So in disasters, when the word is used, it implicitly means that you have that interaction. So this is why they get kind of hung up on this, and they go, well, there's no such thing as a natural disaster because you have the vulnerability. And because there's the vulnerability, it's not natural. If you weren't vulnerable, it wouldn't have happened to you. So it's not natural. So that's kind of the way they're focused on it. Now, that's when you've gotten into the industry a bit. Let's move on to a more seasoned expert. A more seasoned expert will look at this and say, okay, disaster is the thing that told me what happened, but natural is the qualifier. So when we might say it's a natural disaster or it's a man-made or person-made disaster, that's referring to what the hazard was and what the hazard profile is. So generally, when one is speaking from that perspective and you're looking at the hazard side, so if I were to say something that this hurricane was a natural disaster, then I might be saying, well, the disaster happened, the vulnerability was man-made, but the hazard was natural, so I'm qualifying that. Why is there that distinction? Why does that matter? If something is natural in a disaster management or emergency management, either one, point of view, then you're not as concerned about people being afraid of people. When you're dealing with human-caused disasters, that is an additional variable. So think about how you would respond to something like a flood versus how you would respond to something like a flood caused by someone blowing up the hydroelectric dam. One of those is human caused directly in that the human is causing the hazard and you're worried about other people doing bad things. The other is something that was not intentionally, maliciously caused. That's the separation there. When you have a natural disaster in that sort of context, you tend to have people coming together and helping out. It's more communal. When you have a human-caused disaster, depending on what it is, you generally don't have as much collaboration. There's a much bigger risk of people being concerned that their neighbor is the enemy. You don't have that with a flood generally. You will have that with a bomb going off. That's kind of why the separation is there. There's certain characteristics that are part of the natural hazard that feeds into the natural disaster definition versus the other. Now, why am I saying all this? Why is this distinction relevant? The way I viewed this, and the first thing when I saw this campaign, and it was interesting that John brought this to me too, because we've talked about it in some classes before, but I haven't done an article on this one yet, or really done a public thing on it because it's kind of inside baseball. The interesting thing about this is, let's say that one is the person that listens to the recommendation from the United Nations DRR, goes to one of these conferences, and some expert gets up in front of the podium and says the word natural disaster, and then you say, hey, that's wrong. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. What will happen basically, or what may happen, what's at risk of happening, is the person on the podium probably knows that the disaster is human caused, or it has a human component in that they are vulnerable. And they're probably using the word natural as a qualifier to explain the hazard that is, causing the disaster. So they probably know that. But the person who is saying that to them is treating them like they are a layperson. So what this comes across as is basically patronizing and talking down to somebody that has more experience. Professionally, this is generally a bad idea. It may be the case, and this is a very friendly industry generally speaking, so it may be the case that they think your heart's in the right place and you were trying, and it's like, well, no, that's not how this word is used. But you might run the risk of offending somebody that could be a mentor, right? There's that sort of in there. Now, that's one side of it. The other side of this is, look, this causes videos like this to exist. This causes people to talk about these sorts of things. If maybe some more lay people get a better understanding that, you could protect yourself better from the flood is somewhat within your control, because although it is a natural hazard, you could make yourself less vulnerable to it by buying a house or renting a house in an area that's lower risk to floods. If you're worried about floods, choosing where you're going to live. If you have the luxury to choose that, you can be more discerning looking at these sort of risks. If you're concerned about fires are another one of those, natural hazards, but fires can be both natural or human caused. You can light your house on fire with a match. You could be impacted by a forest fire. I'll get into that in a second, but the point is that you could take certain actions to be less susceptible to said fire on the vulnerability side, or even on the exposure side. You could make yourself less likely to be exposed to it. So there is some merit there. So even though one, they can come off as patronizing and it's like, why are you doing this? That's not how that word works. Fair enough. But on the other side, you could, potentially get some more people to be interested in this topic. So there's a bit of a kind of a double-edged sword there with it. Okay, that's the first part of this whole conversation. The second thing that you look at when you look at there's no such thing as a natural disaster is the idea that even natural hazards are actually human-caused. So some people will make the argument that the hurricane was caused by human behavior. This is an interesting argument to make. Usually this argument will be made from the perspective of global warming. So they'll make the sort of argument like, if it wasn't for human activity, then the hurricanes wouldn't be as frequent or as often. Thus, this hurricane is caused by people. Thus, it's not natural. It's human caused. Okay, there's a few problems with that. The first, it's basically impossible. It's impractical to actually determine which hurricane was directly caused by human behavior versus not, because the discussion of climate change, global warming, and the way meteorology works, there's a lot of variables, and certain weather systems were going to happen regardless of if humans were there or not. That's the first problem. The second problem is intent. The point of the separation between the natural disaster and the human-caused, man-made, whatever, disaster category, the purpose of that separation is to kind of say, this one over here, we can change the way we behave, we can change certain processes, and it will, by and large, just eliminate this as a hazard and then as a disaster on the hazard side. And this one over here, well, this one's going to happen anyways. And it's a thing that happens and we don't have real control over this. If one is to make the argument that hurricanes and floods and all natural phenomena, as it were, are actually human-caused, then you basically have to assume that we control all weather, and you've run the risk of going down the sort of conspiracy theory slippery slope rabbit hole of having to support theories in space lasers, chemtrails, and weather machines, which gets really impractical real fast. I don't think that it is in the interest of people that are trying to get people more involved in preparedness and not dying to things, and you show up at someone's house because there's a hurricane and storm surges coming and you're concerned about them evacuating, and you say, hey, can you please evacuate your house? And they're like, I don't want to. And you're like, okay, well, write your social security number on your arm so we can identify your body. Thanks for making my day easier. And then you walk away. That's actually standard practice. So you want to help inform those people to just evacuate instead of, you're kind of trying to fight that battle. And it's hard to fight that battle when your credibility is at risk of being negatively impacted by having to justify why people don't have space lasers. It doesn't work. So I don't prefer that sort of argumentation that people caused the hurricane. Now look, you can certainly make the argument, there is significant science to support this, that human behavior has negatively impacted these risks. So data has shown in this industry, and the overwhelming conclusion in studying for this, like when I was in my undergrad and my master's, and then further on outwards and years prior, the data was abundantly clear that all of these large weather events and these disasters, or specifically the hazards that leads to them, but these hazards are becoming more frequent and in greater intensity over time. So there's more of them happening more often, and the ones that happen more often happen with greater intensity. This is basically a fact, effectively, in the industry. If that were not true, then the whole industry would have to be rethought, basically, on the way a lot of these preparedness things are being done. So it's just a known thing in the industry, to the degree that no one even questions it anymore. That doesn't mean that it's correct, but I'm just saying the degree to which it's believed. You can certainly have a conversation about, well, maybe we should do this and this and this to reduce emissions, because emission reduction will likely result in less hurricanes in the next 50 years. And you could make a whole study on that, and you could have that sort of conversation. But that's a nuanced conversation that is different from blaming your neighbor that has a gasoline vehicle for causing the windstorm that blew off your shingles. What are we doing? There's a line, right? And I'm seeing kind of that nuance getting lost with this. So are there such things as natural disasters? Yes, kind of. It depends on how you decide to structure that sentence. If you think that the natural in that is a qualifier for the hazard that's causing the disaster, which is the way I and virtually everyone I've seen in this industry who've been established in it view it. In fact, the Canadian Disaster Database has disasters categorized by hazard type, and natural is a section category. So, we kind of do that. If you like that, then great. And if you want to get really focused on that disaster thing, then you have to leave natural out. But then think about this. If there's no such thing as a natural disaster, then a man-made or person-made disaster is kind of redundant, wouldn't it be? Because If they're all man-made, then why would you say man-made disaster? It's just implicit. We would just say disaster. There'd be no point of any qualifier. Like it's like saying that I have a crayon. Not I have a crayon, but I have a crayon. Well, what kind of crayon is it? It's a crayon. Well, what do you mean? Well, it's a thing. Why not just say it once? It just gets, I think the right word is like pedantic. I don't know. It sounds preachy. Just don't do that. Okay, we're having a hard enough time trying to get people to believe in caring about forecasting for the next, month, year, etc. People's incomes are tight and they're not thinking about long term. We're having a hard enough time with that without talking down to people. Just I don't know. I just don't like that. Anyways, that's the rant on this. Hopefully that satisfies your curiosity, John, and anybody else who benefits from John poking me with random things. See you next time.